Okay, think about bouncing back after a hurricane. It's chaos, right? And you'd think your local leaders, the ones on the ground, should have the flexibility they need to, get things right for their own community.
You would, yeah.
But there's this new bill in Florida, SB 180, that really, well, it throws that whole idea of local control into question, especially when it comes to rebuilding.
It really does.
Mm.
We're looking at Senate Bill 180 today, and while a lot of it is about emergency management on the surface,
Right.
there's this amendment tucked in there
Yeah.
about land use and development after a storm hits.
Yeah.
And that part, it's got a lot of people worried, frankly. It
Yeah.
raises big questions about who gets the final say on how communities rebuild.
Exactly. So, to really get a handle on this, we've dug into the official bill summary from the Florida Senate itself, a very insightful piece from the Bradenton Times, and also a report from WESH2 News.
Good sources.
Yeah, and our mission here is pretty straightforward. Cut through the legislative jargon, figure out what SB 180 actually does, why it's causing such a stir, and what it could mean for you, for communities on the ground. So, what's the big picture with this bill?
Well, fundamentally, it's presented as an emergency management bill,
Right.
trying to improve how Florida prepares for and responds to disasters.
Okay.
And it covers a lot, things like the responsibilities of FDM, that's the Florida Division of Emergency Management, how they prioritize funding for shelters,
Mhm.
especially pushing for more shelters in areas that lack them, encouraging retrofitting public buildings, not just schools.
Right, I saw that. And it looks like it tries to tighten up some administrative things too, like more detailed reports from FDM to the legislature and getting emergency contracts tracked publicly.
Yes, exactly. Transparency, efficiency,
Mm.
those seem to be goals there. That all feels like pretty standard governmental housekeeping, you could say.
Makes sense.
The bill also puts expectations on local governments,
Mhm.
making emergency info easy to find online, developing clear plans for permitting after a storm to speed things up, even identifying potential spots for debris before a storm hits.
Proactive stuff.
Right. And there are other bits, like preventing permit fee increases for 6 months post-hurricane, some tweaks related to flood insurance, property appraisals. So, yeah, a big chunk of this is focused on those immediate emergency response logistics.
Okay, but then there's this other piece, the land use amendment. That's where it gets controversial, right? It almost feels tacked on to an emergency bill.
That's exactly why it's drawing so much fire. This amendment adds a pretty major restriction for a whole year after a hurricane makes landfall.
Whole year?
A full year. If a county gets a federal disaster declaration, or for any city within that county that's within 100 miles of the storm's track, those local governments are basically blocked, prohibited from proposing or adopting any new moratoriums on construction or any land development rules that are seen as, quote, more restrictive or burdensome.
Wow. And this isn't just for future storms, is it? The Bradenton Times piece really stressed the retroactive part, applying back to Hurricanes Debbie, Helene, and Milton.
That's right, retroactive, extending until October 1st, 2027, and looking back to August 1st, 2024. It's a huge time frame and scope.
That seems incredibly broad.
It is. And here's the kicker, something both the Bradenton Times and WESH2 highlighted. Because of how those 2024 disaster declarations played out, every single county in Florida was included in at least one.
Wait, every county?
Every single one. So while the language sounds specific, the practical effect is statewide.
Mm.
Any local planning rule put in place since August 1st, 2024, that might limit development, potentially invalid. Anything a local government might want to do in that year after the next hurricane to maybe, say, require building higher or further back, blocked.
Okay, so this is where the alarm bells start ringing for local officials and environmental groups. The Bradenton Times, WESH2, they talk about this being an attack on home rule. What's the heart of that concern?
Home rule is, well, it's the basic idea that your local town or county should have the right to govern itself on local matters, especially things like zoning, land use, how the community grows.
Makes sense.
The worry here is that SB 180 is the state government reaching down and taking away that local decision-making power at a really critical time, right when communities are trying to figure out how to rebuild safely after a disaster.
And we heard that loud and clear from Jeff Brower, the Volusia County chair, in that WESH2 report. He was blunt. He said, the legislature is telling us you can't make those changes. You can't protect your own citizens. So who are we protecting? Just developers. That really hits the nail on the head for the opposition, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. That quote captures the core argument, that this specific provision seems to prioritize development interests, maybe speedy development, over the local government's job to protect residents and plan for a more resilient future, especially knowing more storms are likely.
Yeah.
There's a real fear, that this could undo smart land use changes made since August 2024, changes aimed at maybe preventing the same kind of damage next time. And it definitely puts a freeze on implementing any new lessons learned for a whole year after a storm.
And the Bradenton Times brought up another angle, the lack of a clear definition for restrictive or burdensome. That sounds like a recipe for arguments, maybe even lawsuits.
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge gray area. What's restrictive? What's burdensome? Without clear definitions, state agencies, or more likely developers, could interpret that very broadly. A rule meant to protect wetlands could be called burdensome. A rule requiring stronger roofs, restrictive.
So a developer could just challenge almost anything.
Potentially, yes. And the bill specifically gives them the right to sue local governments over this. They can ask a court to basically throw out the local rule. And here's a key part. If the developer wins the lawsuit, the local government, meaning taxpayers, really could have to pay the developer's attorney fees and court costs.
Oh, wow. So not only could local governments be stopped from making rules they think are needed for safety or sustainability,
Right.
but they could also get hit with massive legal bills if they even try. That sounds like it would make any local council think twice. A real chilling effect.
That's exactly the term people are using. A chilling effect on local governance. The Bradenton Times mentioned it could even threaten things like Orange County's new Rural Boundary Plan, which is all about managing growth locally.
Hmm.
And you have groups like 1,000 Friends of Florida actively campaigning against this, telling citizens to contact their lawmakers, calling this specific provision a, quote, fatal flaw in an otherwise potentially useful emergency management bill.
Okay, so the opposition is pretty clear.
Mhm.
Loss of local control, favoring developers, potential for lawsuits, hindering resilient rebuilding. What about the other side? What's the justification for this amendment? Senator Deiskli, who sponsored the bill, must have a rationale. WESH2 mentioned his view.
Yes, they did. According to WESH2, Senator Deiskli's position is that Senate Bill 180 ensures local governments focus on rebuilding communities, not stifling the recovery process. He argues, the bill empowers residents and businesses to recover more efficiently after disasters by streamlining permitting and reducing unnecessary regulatory hurdles.
Okay, so the argument is about speed, efficiency, getting things rebuilt faster. The idea is that stopping new, potentially restrictive rules for a year clears the path, cuts red tape.
That's the core justification. Prevent local governments from, perhaps in the heat of the moment after a disaster, enacting new regulations that might slow down reconstruction or make it more expensive. Keep the focus squarely on getting buildings back up and businesses reopened.
And as you said earlier, there are other parts of the bill aimed at streamlining, like those post-storm permitting plans.
Exactly. Proponents would point to those parts too, saying the whole package is designed to make recovery smoother and faster. This one-year pause on new rules is just part of that larger effort from their perspective. Got it. And what about that OPAGA study mentioned in the Senate summary? Where does that fit in?
Right. OPAGA, that's the state legislature's research arm, the Office of Program Policy Analysis and Government Accountability. They're tasked by this bill to study what local governments actually do regarding land development after hurricanes.
Ah, so they're going to look into this issue more deeply.
Apparently so. They need to produce a report with recommendations by December 1st, 2025. The goal is supposedly to find ways to streamline things further and prevent what the bill calls burdensome or restrictive local actions. So it suggests maybe the legislature acknowledges this is complex and wants more data, but they put the restriction in place before getting the data.
Interesting timing. Okay, so boiling it down, we've got this real tension.
Right.
On one hand, the state pushing for faster, potentially less regulated rebuilding immediately after a storm. The argument is efficiency.
Right. Cut the red tape, get back to normal quickly. And on the other hand, you have local communities and advocates saying, hold on, we need the ability to learn from these disasters, to make rules that protect us better next time, to control our own growth. That's the home rule argument.
That's the core conflict, precisely. SB 180, especially this land use part, really shifts the power dynamic away from local control towards the state, at least for that critical year after a hurricane.
And thinking longer term, these decisions about rebuilding aren't just about that first year, are they? How and where you rebuild impacts a community's vulnerability for decades. Limiting local input seems like it could have really lasting consequences.
It absolutely could. Which brings us to the big question for you listening right now. We know storms are getting stronger, sea levels are rising. In that context, if a bill like SB 180 limits your local community's power to adapt,
to maybe say no to building in risky areas or yes to stronger standards? What does real resilience actually look like for Florida? And maybe more importantly, what role should your voice and your local leaders' voices have in shaping that future? How much control should stay local when it comes to preparing for the next storm?